The Edmonton Oilers are doing the dirty work to maybe be able to keep Philip Broberg. But why is that so important?
You are Locked On Oilers, your daily podcast on the Edmonton Oilers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Tuesday edition of Locked On Oilers. I'm your host, Nick Zararis. I want to thank everybody who makes Locked On Oilers their first listen of the day. Locked On Oilers, a part of the Locked On Podcast Network. In today's episode, I said it on Monday's show, and I followed up. I made sure not to lose train of thought for the first time in my life. Overactive mind, lots of thoughts racing, mumbling, all throughout all hours of the day. But I wanted to do a real analysis of Philip Broberg as a player, and we're going to unpack this from a few different angles. We're going to talk about it purely from a narrative, why the Oilers are kind of stuck at this crossroads with their defense core as a whole. We're going to talk about Broberg individually. We're going to talk about his results in the playoffs with Nurse. We'll talk about his regular season results, the 12 games he played in the 2023-2024 regular season. And then the final segment, we're going to touch on why the Oilers kind of don't really have a choice. And even though they don't really have a choice, they're really gambling on Broberg, the player. So let's start at the outset. When you are trying to win the Stanley Cup, genuinely trying to win the Stanley Cup, you have to make certain calculations. You have to think about your roster in certain ways. And I alluded to this on Monday's episode, and I'll reiterate it now. It is very rare for Stanley Cup championship winning teams to have multiple rookies in their lineup. And Broberg's not a rookie. He's had sprinklings of NHL games over the last 3 seasons. So he doesn't fit that typical box. But from the purposes of where he's at in his development, how far along he is not that far along in his development. He does not have a ton of NHL experience. So it's important to understand that the Oilers have backed themselves into this corner because they've continued to ante up. They've continued to push chips into the middle. And I tweeted this last night after I published Monday's episode, but the Oilers are extremely over-leveraged in the short term. And over-leveraged, you should be familiar with. In North America, especially in the United States, credit card debt has hit an all-time high over the course of the summer. And part of that is people trying to keep up with the rate of it, with inflation. So they're spending more money. And to make up for the losses and the increase in the cost of goods, people are buying more things with credit. And when you over leverage yourself, when you buy something and then it's on 20%, you're paying 20% interest on, a $40 t-shirt, that doesn't sound that bad. But if you're paying $48 and you only make the minimum payment, it's the $38. And it's not a direct one-to-one. But the Oilers have kind of done that with their roster construction over the last handful of seasons. They have pushed chips in, they have pushed chips in, they have pushed chips in. And when you have Connor McDavid, you have Leon Draisaitl, it's justifiable that you're going to keep leveraging your roster for the immediate, for the present, not for the future. You're not long-term planning. You're not long-range planning. And you can tell very clearly that the Oilers are running this ship day to day. And no matter how much credence you want to put into the various reports that Ken Holland was told in January of 2024, hey, start working out those Holloway and Broberg extensions now. Whether you want to believe those, take those at face value or not, or if you want to look at that as retroactively putting some blame on Ken Holland, who's no longer with the organization, as to absolve the current decision makers of responsibility, that's your prerogative. You are allowed to interpret information how you see fit. And frankly, I don't know how much I want to put into that, because the way I always think about news reports in sports, and frankly, in news reports in general, when news comes out, your first thought should be, who does this help? Especially when it's hearsay and secondhand reporting. It's not directly actionable information. It's not Jeff Jackson. It's not Stan Bowman. It's not Ken Holland. It is reports say that ownership and the leadership of the team told Ken Holland. So who does that make look bad? Ken Holland. Who does that make look good? Ownership and the controlling interests of the team, who are still with the organization. So you should think about it from that perspective. Whenever there is news that comes out, Who does this help? Why is it being framed in this way? And how do we go from here and putting that into what we understand about the story as a whole? Because anytime we're talking about transaction news, we're talking about extensions, we're talking about trades, it is a slow burn. Like those two trades, the Cody Ceci trade and the Vasily Podkolzin trade, those were not agreed to last night. They were not all worked out over the course of a Sunday. They've probably been working out over the course of the last week. As soon as those offer sheets go out, the Oilers probably started trying to figure out their contingency plans. This does tell me, to some degree, that the Oilers had not a direct course of action for the offer sheets if they were to happen, because there's no way to have known that offer sheets at these exact dollar amounts were going to come. But the fact that they were able to make these trades happen, and look, I understand midnight Sunday night is very funny to be getting work done as somebody who, as somebody who went to college, I'm very familiar with the midnight deadline of a Sunday into a Monday. And if it's not in by 11:59, too bad. But that's kind of how it feels. I want to say this before we move along, and one last thing in this segment. The Oilers are backed into this corner because it is a lot harder to get quality defense in the NHL than it is to get quality forward. The defenseman market is still kind of evolving, it's developing, and it's because the position itself has changed. And in today's league, you need guys who can move the puck, who have strong skating instincts, and have really good positioning. The actual defensive components of playing defense, those are even harder to come by. That's why a guy like a Mackenzie Weegar, a Gus Forsling, somebody who is an elite defensive defenseman, is so hard to come by because that skill set hasn't been prioritized. When we're talking about guys' development and their junior years, their first year after being drafted second, etc., the only way to get paid as a defenseman in the NHL is to record points. You look at the highest paid defensemen in the NHL, Erik Karlsson, Rasmus Dahlin, Drew Doughty. There are a lot of guys who make a lot of money playing defense, Cale Makar, because they put up points. Those guys are always going to get paid more than a Gus Forsling, a Mackenzie Weegar, because defense is not quantifiable. It is a negative. Taking away another team's offense, you can't exactly put a number on that. It's not like goals and assists where it's very straightforward. You put up, for every 10 points, you should get about $1 million. For every 10 goals, it should be about $1.5 million. And once you start getting that number, that rough estimate in your head, you can start piece together how much a guy is exactly worth. When it comes to the Oilers, they have boxed themselves into this corner with their defensive core because they have staked themselves as an offense-first team. When you are paying McDavid and Draisaitl a combined $23 million, you throw Nugent there for $6 million, Hyman for $5.5 million, Kane for $5 million. Really quickly, you're almost at $40 million on 5 forwards, and then it becomes a lot harder to get that Drew Doughty, to get that Roman Josi, to get that Miro Heiskanen. Luckily for the Oilers, they drafted Evan Bouchard, who is going to be making a ton of money for a defenseman going forward. But again, once you start paying Bouchard, your ability to distribute that money throughout your roster more evenly goes away. And that's what I mean by over leverage. The Oilers have so much spent on their forward group that it's harder to build out a quality defense. And their one big swing financially on the back end, Darnell Nurse, it looks like a miss. It looks like that contract is objectively bad and going to continue to be bad into the near future. The Athletic had that as one of the 10 worst contracts in the NHL going into this upcoming season. So with that in mind, we are going to take a quick break. Then we're going to come back. We're going to tackle Broberg's results last year in the regular season and in the postseason. So stick around to this episode of Locked On Oilers, where we've got your team covered every day. Passion, drive, and patience. The formula for winning championships is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need, the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP. and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions do apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit is only available for U.S. customers. Thank you for making Locked On Oilers your first listen of the day. For your second listen, enjoy the Locked On NHL podcast. Locked On NHL provides you with a national perspective on all things NHL each and every day. National experts and local insight on every team in the league. Available on YouTube or wherever you get your podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So in unpacking this Broberg situation, it's important to understand that a lot of what the Oilers are banking on in terms of Broberg going forward is hypothetical. And this is why I always say, if you are a rebuilding team, if you are a team that's not yet competitive, the best thing you can do is accumulate as many of these young guys as you possibly can. Because the blank slate player, the player who doesn't have baggage, who doesn't have a reputation, it enables your fan base to latch on to them, to project onto them, and to give them an outsized role of influence that, yeah, this guy doesn't have a ton of NHL experience, but we drafted him really highly. The organization has made his development a priority by not subjecting him to the NHL before he was ready. He thrived at lower levels before they brought him up. They've been very cautious about his usage at the NHL level to put him in a position to succeed so that it is inevitable that he eventually succeeds. And that's it's a ploy. It's a trick. It's a way for front offices to give their fan bases something to latch onto, the speculative player, the projection player that everything about his trajectory says this is going to be a useful quality NHL player, even though it's leaving a lot to the unknown. And I talked about this on yesterday's show. I talked about this last week. Broberg and Holloway don't have a lot of experience. And when you don't have a lot of experience, it's hard to get fair value at the bargaining table. It is hard to say, well, I think I'm worth this because X, Y, and Z. Because the general manager of the team that you're negotiating with is going to point at your stat sheet and say, you didn't play that much. And we can be objective here. I think at minimum, we can safely say Philip Broberg is an NHL caliber defenseman. What level of NHL caliber defenseman, that's to be determined. And he's still young enough where you're going to have ups and downs, and that development is probably not going to be linear. It's important to note that he's 2019 draft class, and that draft in particular has aged weird retroactively. And I think it's fair to say a lot of players in the 2019, 2021, and 2020, 2019, 2020, and 2021, that 3-year period, all of those players in particular, and this is still true to this day, even the 2022, 23, all of those players in those respective drafts had years of their development derailed by the pandemic. There are a lot of guys who played junior hockey from the fall of 2019 into the spring of 2020, played no games from March to December of 2020. And then a lot of them got drafted and had to go right to the NHL as 18 or 19-year-olds in that 56-game 2021 season. And even the guys who were drafted in 2021, their pre-draft year was derailed by the pandemic. And that is essential because when you are at that point in your career, when you're 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, you need as much workload as you can possibly get. You need reps, you need game time, you need experience. And losing half a season, or in some cases, a whole season of your development at the most crucial period of your career, it can really derail the long-term trajectory. So instead of being all the way up here, your trajectory might peak out instead of here because you missed an opportunity to play on a first power play unit in your draft year, to put up good counting stats, to go to a better situation where you're going to be given the opportunity to play more. And I alluded to this yesterday. I alluded to this earlier in the show, but the Oilers have really slow played Broberg. A lot of time in the AHL, opting for guys like Vincent Desharnais and Cody Ceci and Brett Kulak, as opposed to maybe giving somebody like Broberg a shot. Because as a team that is trying to contend for the Stanley Cup, you don't have time to give guys opportunities to make mistakes. Because the mistakes when you're drafted to the Sharks are a lot less consequential than the mistakes you make when you're on the Oilers. The one caveat to this is I do wish teams were more willing to allow young guys to make mistakes as opposed to veterans to make mistakes. As much as the NHL decision makers might value Cody Ceci's 10 years in the NHL, if it's not good experience, I don't know why that matters. So, stats-wise, Philip Broberg has played 1,029 minutes in the NHL. He is 22 years old. He averages 12:42 average time on ice. That number has got to come up going forward. So, this past regular season, 49 minutes with Brett Kulak, 24 minutes with Vincent Desharnais, 17 minutes with Matthias Ekholm. In the playoffs, 76-58 with Darnell Nurse. 7 goals for, 2 against. The caveat here is when you go under the hood, the conditions for that 7-2 split are not very replicable. So what do I mean by that? When that duo was on the ice together, the Oilers had 49 scoring chances for, and they conceded 95 scoring chances. They generated 2.11 expected goals. They conceded 4.87 expected goals. They generated 9 high danger chances. They conceded 18 high danger chances. They had a 17.3 shooting percentage and a 9.47 save percentage. Everything about those numbers tells you the results that Broberg and Nurse got with Broberg playing on the right were not particularly replicable. It was extremely unlikely that a duo is going to be on the ice and score on 17% of their shots, and the goalie was going to save almost 95% of those shots. I think it's safe to say that duo had the fortune of some good shooting luck and some good goaltending. And why do we care about those things? Those are not sticky. Shooting percentage and save percentage, they vary, they bounce, they move around because there are so many variables that go into a given hockey play. Somebody can have the shooting year of their life, go for 20%, score 40 goals, and the next year they come back down to earth and they shoot like 12% and they're back down to 22 goals. Or if you're talking about a goalie, think about how impossible it is to predict the goaltending position in today's NHL year over year because environment matters so much. I think Nurse and Broberg have the potential to be a useful, functional defensive pair. I would not be staking the last year of my Stanley Cup window with McDavid and Draisaitl being worth about 20 million of the cap as opposed to like 30 million of the cap on the proposition that Broberg and Nurse are going to be a quality second pair, because I think that's just leaving too much to chance. But this is the corner the Oilers have backed themselves into. When you are over leveraged, when you have staked a lot on the short term, you don't have as many options. You can't say, oh, well, we're going to do this instead. This is their option. And the Blues have really pushed the Oilers into a corner here as far as the financial allocation of where they're spending money on their roster and the decision making. Because now you did your CC trade, you brought in Podkolzin to probably be your Holloway replacement, all on the premise that we need to match this contract for Broberg, and so much of Broberg is unknown. We're going to take one more quick break here on this episode of Locked On Oilers, where we've got your team covered every day, and we're going to talk all about why it's such a gamble to keep rolling, to match the offer sheet on Philip Broberg. We'll be right back. We're all driven by the search for better, but when it comes to hiring, the best way to search for a candidate isn't to search at all. Don't search, match with Indeed. If you need to hire, you need Indeed. Indeed is your matching and hiring platform with over 350 million global monthly visitors, according to Indeed data, and a matching engine that helps you find quality candidates fast. Ditch the busy work. Use Indeed for scheduling, screening, and messaging so you can connect with candidates faster. And Indeed doesn't just help you hire faster. 93% of employers agree. Indeed delivers the highest quality matches compared to other job sites, according to a recent Indeed survey. The one thing I love about Indeed is it leverages over 140 million qualifications and preferences every day. That means Indeed's matching engine is constantly learning from your preferences, so the more you use Indeed, the better it gets. Join 3.5 million businesses worldwide that use Indeed to hire great talent. And listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/locked on. Just go to Indeed.com/lockedon right now and support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Indeed.com/lockedon. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire? You need Indeed. Thank you to everybody who is hanging out listening to this Tuesday edition of Locked On Oilers, where it is all things Philip Broberg on the ice and narrative-wise. And as frustrating as this situation is for the Oilers, I think this is a learning opportunity here. One of my best friends in life, Chris, he always says, every day is a school day. Anytime we bring up something minor, something small, like the other day we were talking about Smashing Pumpkins, the band, and we were talking about how the lead singer of Smashing Pumpkins, and this is a little silly, but we didn't realize that Billy Corgan, the one who's the lead singer of Smashing Pumpkins, was also the owner, operator, and leader of the NWA, the indie wrestling promotion, the Northern Wrestling Alliance. We just thought they were two guys who looked similar to each other. We didn't realize they were the same person. And he looked at me and goes, every day is a school day. And that's what this is for the Oilers. It is, and it was, going back to his time in Detroit, a Ken Holland foundational principle to slow play your prospects. You want to give them as much time, if not too much time, in the AHL so that there's no adjustment period, that they have been in the AHL for 2 or 3 seasons. So they are ready to go. The minute you drop them in the NHL, the thought process is, well, they're 22 years old. They're physically mature, so they have the size to be at this level. They've played with our guys, and we have put veterans in our AHL system to be there specifically for the purpose of preparing these guys mentally for what it's like to be in the NHL. And all of that is noble in its idea. It's also an outdated principle because of where value is in the NHL contract system right now. You cannot, in good faith, I should say, tell me that burning a guy's entry-level contract to play in the AHL and then getting 1 year on that ELC at the NHL level is good cost efficiency. Now, some guys do genuinely need the AHL. They need to stay in college for another year. They need to physically mature to go. You think about it. You need to put on 15 to 20 pounds going from playing Division I college hockey as a 17, 18-year-old to a 19, 20-year-old to play in the NHL. You're not going to be able to play in the NHL at 165, 170 pounds if you're over 5'7". You know, if you're Matt Zuccarello, you can play in the NHL at 170, 175 pounds. If you're 6'1", and you're 165 pounds and you're rail thin, an NHL team is going to look at you and say, no, you need to stay in college. You need to put on some mass. You need to take your strength training seriously. Next year, come to prospect camp. We'll get a good look at you. And if we think you're physically ready, you can play in some preseason games and we'll give you a shot. And I know that's not as fair of a comp because college guys can't go to the AHL. You have to be at least 20 to play in the AHL. And once you play in preseason games, you can't go back to NCAA because of the amateurism rules. But that all might be going away because of lawsuits here in the States in regards to eligibility to play college hockey based on money and what you do in terms of preseason. That is going to be all sorted out over the next handful of years in the court system here. The NHL and AHL may eventually just acquiesce. College in general may just acquiesce and allow a more traditional pipeline. But in regards to Broberg, to Holloway, and the Oilers and their young guys going forward, you have learned a lesson. No matter how much you think of a guy, if you don't give them an opportunity, they are going to feel a way about that. Some guys might take that with the chip on their shoulder and say, well, I'm going to prove you wrong. In the case of Broberg and Holloway, I don't want to call it alienation because they were very clearly both important parts of the Oilers' run to the Stanley Cup final. But feeling that you're not a priority, it does matter. And Dylan Holloway doubling his money, Philip Broberg quadrupling his money year over year to go to a bad team. Some people will look at that and say, well, don't you want to win? I look at it like this. Yes, if it were me, I would be okay with making, $925 trying to win the Stanley Cup. I am also not a world-class athlete who has the opportunity to make life-changing amounts of money with just my God-given natural ability and a little bit of working out. I can understand why somebody like Philip Broberg would say, do I really want to drag around Darnell Nurse and not be given opportunities because I'm playing with Darnell Nurse? Or do I want to go to St. Louis, where if I bet on myself and I play as well as I think I can, I'm going to play myself into a long-term deal that's worth $6, $7, $8, $9 million per year, because I'm going to get first power play opportunities. I'm going to get a chance maybe to play on a first pair. If you stay in Edmonton, and look, I know this is the very pessimistic view. I'll give you the counterpoint view, the Oilers perspective in a second, but you do have to understand why Broberg and Holloway were willing to sign offer sheets, because that's an important component of this story. A lot of guys don't take them because they don't want to go from what the team they're on that has been invested in them since their draft night to another organization that might be, and like in the Blues case, just trying to be competitive, just trying to hang around. Whereas there is a long-term outlook here where if the Oilers match on Broberg and everything works out, 2 or 3 years from now, there's a good chance your first defensive pair is Evan Bouchard and Philip Broberg. 2 or 3 years from now, that very well could be your first pair, and you could be looking at a quality first pair you have for the better part of a decade because you've put the work into both of those guys. You've slow played their development. You've attached them to veterans with lots of experience. They've taken their lumps, and they're the backbone of your team that you build around Draisaitl, McDavid, Bouchard, Broberg, probably Stuart Skinner, but no assurances there. And instead, we're kind of sitting here at this crossroads. And I said it on Monday's show, this may be outdated. The Oilers probably will have matched Philip Broberg by the time you are watching or listening to today's show. But I do want you to think about these things a bit more conceptually, that, well, you got to think about Broberg, you got to think about the Oilers, you got to think about the media sources that are reporting this news, why they're reporting it, who benefits from it. You got to think, well, why are the Oilers taking so much risk? Why are the Oilers about to give a defenseman with not less than 90 career NHL regular season games $4.6 million per year as a 22-year-old? Well, they leveraged themselves year after year after year where they didn't have the draft picks to pick a defenseman, to develop them, to bring them along. They didn't have the willingness to let Philip Broberg make his mistakes at the NHL level, so they didn't know as much about him as they should. And because of that, they weren't willing to offer him as much money as he felt he was willing to earn. He deserved. And because of that, he was willing to listen and ultimately accept an offer sheet from the St. Louis Blues. All of this is interconnected, and it's hard to think in multiple dimensions. I understand. But that's what makes talking about this, that's what makes doing a podcast so useful and so essential, because we can unpack things in this format from a whole bunch of different angles that you probably aren't going to get from just reading or listening to people who covered the team. But that will just about do it for today's edition of Locked On Oilers. So if you could be so kind, please subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. If you're listening on Apple or Spotify, please leave the show a 5-star review. If you're watching on YouTube, hit the subscribe button, hit the alarm bell, so you get a notification whenever new content goes live. Leave me a comment. Do you blame Ken Holland for this, or do you think that this is kind of just a maelstrom of errors converging all on one point that set this situation up and put it into motion? And thank you for making Locked On Oilers your first listen of the day. Now, go check out the Locked On NHL podcast, where the season never ends and provides national expertise with a local perspective. You can find the link to Locked On NHL in the description, so you don't need to search. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I will talk to you guys tomorrow. Until then, let's go Oilers.